December 31st, 2025. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt steps up to a Fox News microphone with a message that sends shockwaves through Minnesota. People will be in handcuffs, she declares, her voice cutting through the morning air. The Department of Justice, as we speak, is continuing to execute search warrants and subpoenas. This isn't just another political soundbite. Behind her words lies the largest fraud investigation in Minnesota history, a cascade of stolen taxpayer dollars so massive that even seasoned prosecutors struggle to comprehend the scale. And right now, federal agents are knocking on doors across Minneapolis. This is the story of how a viral video exposed what officials are calling industrial-scale fraud, how millions in taxpayer money vanished into luxury cars and overseas bank accounts, and how one of America's most controversial investigations is tearing through a state that was supposed to be impossible to rob. But here's the thing. The fraud didn't start last week, and it didn't start last year. It's been happening for nearly half a decade, hidden in plain sight, operating under programs meant to feed hungry children. And now, the federal government is coming for everyone involved. Let's rewind to understand how we got here. It's 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic has just hit America, and the federal government is scrambling to help vulnerable populations. One of those programs is the Federal Child Nutrition Program, which provides children with meals who need them. In Minnesota, a nonprofit called Feeding Our Future steps up. Founded in 2016 by a woman named Amy Bach, the organization claims it can distribute meals to thousands of children across the state. And at first, this seems like exactly what Minnesota needs. But prosecutors now say it was all a lie. According to federal investigators, Feeding Our Future didn't feed children. It fed a criminal empire that would eventually steal over $250 million in taxpayer funds meant for hungry kids during a global pandemic. Here's how it worked. Feeding Our Future recruited hundreds of local groups and businesses to run meal distribution sites across Minnesota. These sites would supposedly serve meals to children, then submit reimbursement claims to the Minnesota Department of Education, which paid them using federal dollars. But many of those claims were completely fabricated. Phony invoices, attendance rosters filled with fake children's names, sites claiming to serve thousands of meals per day while serving almost none. One site, surveilled by the FBI, claimed to serve 6,000 meals daily, but actually averaged around 40 visitors. The scale is staggering. At its peak, Feeding Our Future operated 299 meal sites across Minnesota, claiming to have served 91 million meals in less than 2 years. That's more than 120,000 meals every single day. But federal prosecutors say only about 3% of the funding actually went to food. The rest? It vanished into a network of shell companies, fake vendors, and money laundering operations that stretched from Minneapolis to Kenya to Turkey to China. And the people running these sites weren't hiding their wealth. Court documents paint a picture of absolute excess. Luxury vehicles, Range Rovers, Mercedes-Benzes, Lamborghinis parked outside modest Minneapolis homes, first-class plane tickets to the Maldives, where defendants celebrated honeymoons with money meant for hungry children. Jewelry, designer bags, entire commercial buildings purchased in Kenya. One defendant even bought property in Ohio and Kentucky while operating out of Minnesota. The money flowed everywhere except where it was supposed to go. At the center of it all stood Amy Bach. As executive director of Feeding Our Future, Bach had extraordinary power. She approved meal sites, certified claims, and signed off on reimbursements from the state. Prosecutors say she used that power like a weapon. One witness testified that Bach was seen as a god in how she enforced her authority over the network. She approved implausible meal counts and allegedly cut off operators who refused to comply. When state officials started asking questions, prosecutors claim Bach deployed a different strategy. She accused them of racism and discrimination. You see, while Bach herself is white, most of the people charged in the scheme are of Somali descent. Minnesota has the nation's largest Somali American population, and Feeding Our Future claimed to primarily serve minority communities. In 2020, the organization even sued the state, alleging racial discrimination when officials tried to stop payments. The lawsuit worked. A Minnesota judge found no legal basis for stopping payments and warned there could be a real problem if the state didn't resume processing Feeding Our Future's applications. The lawsuit, according to a later report by Minnesota's Office of the Legislative Auditor, had a chilling effect on oversight functions. State workers were afraid to ask questions, terrified of being labeled racist for investigating fraud. And so the money kept flowing. From 2019 to 2021, Feeding Our Future went from receiving $3.4 million in federal funds to nearly $200 million. That's a 5,700% increase in 2 years. Red flags were everywhere, but everyone was too scared to pull the plug. Then, in January 2022, everything changed. FBI agents raided dozens of Feeding Our Future meal locations across Minneapolis. They seized documents, froze bank accounts, and began building the largest pandemic fraud case in American history. In September 2022, then Attorney General Merrick Garland announced federal charges against 47 former Feeding Our Future employees and contractors. Garland called it the largest pandemic relief fraud scheme charged to date. By the end of President Biden's term, that number had risen to 78 people charged. As of November 2025, dozens have pleaded guilty and 7 have been convicted at trial. Amy Bach, the mastermind, was found guilty in March 2025 on 4 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit federal programs bribery. Another ringleader, Salim Saeed, co-owner of Safari Restaurant, was convicted on similar charges. His restaurant had reported approximately $600,000 in annual revenue before the pandemic. By July 2020, he claimed to be serving meals to 5,000 children per day, 7 days a week. In total, Saeed claimed Safari Restaurant served over 3.9 million meals to children between April 2020 and November 2021. Federal prosecutors proved almost all of it was fake. But here's the problem. Of the $250 million stolen, only around $75 million has been recovered as of early 2025. Much of the money was spent on unrecoverable expenses, like luxury hotels and meals, or transferred to overseas investments that the United States can't seize. The rest is just gone. And prosecutors say Feeding Our Future was just the beginning. Throughout 2024 and 2025, federal investigators uncovered fraud in Minnesota programs across the board. Housing stabilization programs, millions of dollars funneled from Minnesota's Housing Stability Services program, autism treatment programs, at least $14 million stolen from the Early Intensive Developmental and Behavioral Intervention Benefit, a federally funded program for children with autism, Medicaid fraud, multiple programs under investigation, with losses that prosecutors now estimate could reach $9 billion total across all schemes in Minnesota. That number is disputed by state officials, but even conservative estimates put the losses in the hundreds of millions. By late 2025, U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson told a press conference that the magnitude of fraud in Minnesota cannot be overstated. He called the losses staggering and said Minnesota had become a national poster child for public corruption. And then came the video that changed everything. Friday, December 27, 2025. A 23-year-old YouTuber named Nick Shirley posts a 43-minute video to his channel. Shirley is a conservative influencer who had previously made prank videos before pivoting to political content. In October 2024, he even participated in a White House roundtable with Trump administration officials. His latest video claims to expose widespread fraud at taxpayer-funded daycare centers in Minneapolis, specifically targeting facilities in Somali communities. In the footage, Shirley visits nearly a dozen daycares, knocking on doors, peering through windows, claiming these facilities are receiving government funds but providing no services. He points to locked doors, empty parking lots, misspelled signs. His accusation is simple and devastating. These daycares are fake, and they're stealing millions in taxpayer money. The video goes absolutely viral. Within days, it's viewed millions of times on YouTube and seen by tens of millions more on X, formerly Twitter. Vice President J.D. Vance amplifies it. Elon Musk shares it. Right-wing media outlets run it on repeat. By Monday morning, December 30th, federal agents are on the ground in Minneapolis. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem announces that her department is conducting a massive investigation on childcare and other rampant fraud. FBI Director Kash Patel posts that the agency had already surged resources into Minnesota and that feeding our future was just the tip of a very large iceberg. But here's where things get complicated. State officials immediately push back on Shirley's claims. Tikki Brown, commissioner of Minnesota's Department of Children, Youth, and Families, says the state has questions about some of the methods used in the video. CBS News conducts its own analysis and finds that all but 2 of the daycares Shirley highlighted have active licenses and were visited by state regulators within the last 6 months. One facility, Sweet Angel Childcare, was subject to an unannounced inspection as recently as December 4th, just weeks before Shirley's video. The analysis finds dozens of citations related to safety, cleanliness, equipment, and staff training, but no recorded evidence of fraud. Several daycare operators invite reporters inside to see for themselves. One facility shows children actively learning. Teachers explain that it's normal for daycares to keep doors locked for security, and that visitors showing up unannounced with cameras would obviously not be let in. But the damage is done. On Tuesday, December 31st, 2025, the Department of Health and Human Services announces it's freezing all federal child care payments to Minnesota. Deputy HHS Secretary Jim O'Neill and Assistant Secretary Alex Adams demand a comprehensive audit of the facilities featured in Shirley's video. They also implemented new nationwide requirements. All child care payments handled by the Administration for Children and Families will now require justification and receipt or photo evidence before money is sent to any state. The freeze affects $185 million in annual child care payments. Thousands of Minnesota families who depend on these subsidies to afford childcare while working are suddenly at risk of losing access. Legitimate daycare providers face collapse as federal funds they rely on to operate are cut off overnight. One Minneapolis daycare, Nokomis Daycare, which wasn't even featured in Shirley's video, reported being vandalized. Someone broke in between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., stole information about children and employees, and caused extensive damage. A lawyer representing Minnesota Best Child Care, one of the facilities in Shirley's video, says his Somali clients have received hundreds of death threats. Everybody is very scared right now of being targeted, attorney Jason Steck tells reporters. Nobody wants to stick their head up. Nobody wants to get shot. And this brings us to December 31st, 2025, and Karoline Leavitt's warning. Appearing on Fox and Friends, the White House press secretary makes it clear that this investigation is just beginning. This is a top priority for the administration, she says. The Department of Justice, as we speak, is continuing to execute search warrants and subpoenas. The Department of Homeland Security is conducting door-to-door investigations on the ground at potential fraud sites. And they're also conducting continued deportations of illegal aliens in Minnesota's communities. The Department of Health and Human Services cut off all child care funding to Minnesota until the investigation is complete. The Department of Labor is investigating the state's unemployment insurance fraud. The Department of Agriculture demanded Governor Walz turn over every single name of SNAP recipients in the state. When Fox host Griff Jenkins asks if President Trump wants Somalis convicted of fraud to have their citizenship revoked, Leavitt doesn't hesitate. Absolutely, she says, and it's something the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of State, is currently looking at right now. We're also not afraid to use denaturalization. That's a tool the President and the Secretary of State's disposal, and it's one this administration has previously used before. The political implications are massive. Governor Walz, who was Vice President Kamala Harris's running mate in the 2024 presidential election, is now under intense federal scrutiny. Trump has called him a crooked governor and repeatedly attacked his handling of the fraud scandal. Walz, to his part, has tried to defend his record. In a December 12th op-ed in the Minnesota Star-Tribune, he acknowledged the state had been taken advantage of by an organized group of fraudsters, but emphasized actions he's taken. He says he's hired investigators, auditors, and law enforcement, created a head of program integrity position, retained an outside firm to audit high-risk programs, and launched a specialized fraud-fighting law enforcement unit. But critics aren't buying it. Republican Representative Tom Emmer from Minnesota posted on social media that Somalis who have committed fraud against American taxpayers should be sent home. Minnesota DHS workers have reportedly accused Walz of ignoring fraud warnings. Trump and his allies are using Minnesota as a case study for what they call failed democratic governance. Trump has called Minnesota, and Minnesota itself has to rebuild trust in its social services programs. How do you convince people that child care subsidies, food programs, and housing assistance aren't just fraud machines when hundreds of millions of dollars have been stolen from those exact programs? Federal prosecutors and investigators have their work cut out for them. They need to distinguish between legitimate providers and fraudsters, prosecute the guilty without persecuting the innocent, and recover as much stolen money as possible. Given that only $75 million of $250 million has been recovered from feeding our future alone, that last part might be impossible. But the political battle is just beginning. Trump and his allies will use Minnesota fraud as a campaign issue heading into 2026 midterms, painting Democrats as enablers of corruption who are more worried about being called racist than stopping theft. Democrats will argue Trump is exploiting a real problem to justify targeting immigrants and minority communities, using fraud as cover for mass deportations and citizenship revocation. Both sides have some truth on their side, which means this fight will get ugly before it gets resolved. And for the families caught in the middle, the ones who just need affordable childcare so they can go to work, none of this political theater helps them. Their subsidies are frozen, their daycare providers are under investigation or have closed, and nobody can tell them when things will get back to normal, because maybe they won't. Maybe Minnesota fraud marks a turning point in how America handles social service programs, where fear of fraud justifies cutting off support to thousands of people who depend on it. Or maybe it forces states to finally implement oversight systems that catch criminals without presuming guilt based on ethnicity. Time will tell. But right now, on the last day of 2025, the message from the White House is crystal clear. The federal government is coming for everyone involved in Minnesota fraud. Warrants are being executed. Subpoenas are going out. Denaturalization is on the table. And as Karoline Leavitt promised, people will be in handcuffs. The only question is how many and whether justice will be blind or whether innocent people will get swept up in the dragnet. Because in Minnesota right now, it's hard to tell where the pursuit of justice ends and political theater begins. And that ambiguity is exactly what makes this story so dangerous.